When my parents died, I expected at least a piece of the life they built. They had a fortune, a mansion in Los Angeles, cars, investments, everything. But when the lawyer read their will, my sister Mira got it all. Every dollar, every square foot of the estate. And me? I got an old cabin in the middle of Montana that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I felt like I had been slapped across the face. Mira sat in that polished office in her designer coat, hiding a smug little smile, while I stared at the lawyer in disbelief. $4.2 million in property, and my parents gave me a shack that smelled of mold and dead wood. I had been their son for 32 years, their flesh and blood, and this was all I was worth? Mira always had the easy path. She was the golden child, the one my parents bragged about at family gatherings. She had the perfect grades, the perfect friends, the perfect career. They called her their future. I was the afterthought, the kid who fixed broken furniture and spent summers alone at that very cabin. And now, even in death, my parents had managed to remind me that I wasn't enough. I couldn't stomach it. The thought of Mira living in that massive estate, throwing parties in marble rooms while I was left with rotting logs and cracked windows, made my blood boil. I remember gripping the keys to the cabin so tightly in my hand that my knuckles turned white. I didn't want their pity gift. I didn't want their reminder of how little they thought of me. I made up my mind right there. I would drive out to Montana, and I would burn the place to the ground. If they wanted me to inherit a pile of worthless wood, then I'd make sure that pile turned to ash. It felt like the only way to get even, the only way to release the anger clawing at my chest. But when I arrived at the cabin, cold wind biting at my face and snow crunching under my boots, I stepped inside and froze. The place was falling apart, yes, but on the stone fireplace, there was something I didn't expect. A letter. My father's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable, with my name written across the front. To Darren. That single letter stopped me in my tracks, and in that moment, I had no idea that what was inside would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my sister, and the inheritance I was so ready to destroy. I grew up in a family where everything seemed to revolve around appearances. My father, Richard Holt, was a respected real estate developer in Los Angeles. He built a reputation not only for his sharp business sense but also for the way he carried himself. He was the type of man who could walk into a room and instantly command attention. My mother, Alma, was his perfect partner in every way. She had a sharp mind behind her gentle smile and knew exactly how to play the role of the supportive wife. Together, they created a life of wealth and influence that most families would envy. From the outside, it looked like we were living a dream. But inside that dream, there were cracks, and I lived inside those cracks. My older sister, Mira, was everything they wanted. She had the polish, the drive, and the ability to charm people instantly. From an early age, she knew how to carry herself like she was destined for success. Teachers adored her. Neighbors admired her. My parents never stopped telling her how proud they were. I lost count of how many times I heard the words, "Mira, you're going to do great things." While I stood in the background, invisible, I was different. I did not fit into their world of handshakes and business deals. I liked working with my hands, fixing things, building things, repairing broken chairs or tinkering with engines. I found peace in being outside, away from the noise of the city. My happiest memories as a child were not in our Los Angeles mansion, but at the cabin in Montana. I would run through the woods, fish in the streams, and sit by the fireplace, with nothing but the sound of crackling wood. My parents came along sometimes, but it was clear they only saw it as a temporary retreat. To me, though, it felt like the only place where I belonged. Still, no matter how much I tried to prove myself, I could never match Mira in their eyes. When she brought home a perfect report card, it went on the refrigerator. When I built a treehouse by hand, they clapped politely but moved on. When she got accepted into a top college, they threw a party. When I decided to stay local and work with carpentry, they called it a phase. Every success of mine seemed small compared to hers. As we grew older, the gap between us only widened. Mira became the face of the family, moving in the same social circles as my father, dressing in expensive clothes, speaking with the same confidence he did. I became the relative you explained away with a shrug, the son who did not quite measure up, the one who chose a simpler life. And even though I tried to act like it did not bother me, deep down it cut into me every single day. Then came the accident. My parents were gone in an instant. One rainy night, a car crash took them both. The shock hit me harder than I expected. Despite all the resentment, despite the distance, they were still my parents. A part of me hoped that maybe their absence would bring Mira and me closer, that grief would level the field between us. But grief gave way to bitterness the day the will was read. I will never forget sitting in that office, the leather chairs, the smell of polished wood, the lawyer flipping through papers with a calm voice. He read out line after line, and each one was a knife in my chest. Mira was to inherit the Los Angeles estate, valued at $4.2 million, along with all of my father's investments and my mother's jewelry. When he turned to me, his tone softened, almost apologetic. To Darren Holt, he read, "We leave the cabin in Montana." The room went silent. I sat there, stunned, gripping the arms of the chair, waiting for more. There had to be something else. Money, stocks, even a car. But there was nothing. Just the cabin. I remember turning to Mira. Her lips curled into the kind of smile she had always worn when she won, like this was a competition and she had come out on top once again. "They must have known I was ready for the responsibility," she said smoothly. "You always liked that cabin anyway, Darren. Maybe they thought it suited you." Her words hit harder than the lawyer's. I wanted to shout at her, to remind her that I had spent my life trying to earn the approval that came so easily to her. Instead, I sat there shaking, a mix of humiliation and rage boiling inside me. I left that office feeling smaller than ever. My parents were gone, and even in death they had managed to leave me with the same message they had always sent. Mira mattered more. Mira was worthy. I was not. The anger grew until it consumed me. The thought of Mira walking through the halls of that estate, redecorating rooms I had played in as a child, throwing parties under the same roof where I once sat hoping for my parents' attention, made me sick. And the cabin? That rotting structure in the woods? It felt like an insult. Like a final joke at my expense. So I made a decision. If the cabin was all I was worth, then I would destroy it. I would drive to Montana, pour gasoline across the wooden floors, and light a match. I would not let that shack become a reminder of how little my parents valued me. That was the plan when I got into my truck and started the long drive north. The drive to Montana felt like an eternity. Snow pounded against the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up. The heater in my truck roared, but the cold seemed to cut through everything. Every mile I drove gave me more time to think about what had happened, and the more I thought, the angrier I became. I imagined Mira sipping wine in the Los Angeles estate, lounging by the pool that had once been the backdrop of our family barbecues, and laughing with friends about how she had inherited everything. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white, promising myself that I would erase the one thing my parents had thrown at me like scraps. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sight of it only fueled my rage. The roof sagged under the weight of snow. The porch tilted dangerously, and the wood had darkened with rot. The shutters banged against the windows in the howling wind. It looked abandoned, forgotten, exactly like how I had always felt growing up. The anger surged inside me. This was not an inheritance. This was an insult. I stepped out into the biting air, the crunch of snow under my boots the only sound besides the wind. My breath came out in sharp clouds, and for a moment I just stood there, staring at the place I had once loved as a boy. Memories flooded in uninvited. My father teaching me how to split firewood. My mother humming as she cooked by the old stove. Me sitting on the porch with a fishing pole taller than I was. Those memories should have warmed me, but they only made me feel hollow. If those times had mattered, why would my parents throw everything else to Mira and leave me with this? I shook the thoughts away and got to work. In the bed of my truck sat 2 cans of gasoline and a box of matches. My plan was simple. I would pour the gasoline across the floors, strike a match, and watch the cabin burn to ash. It felt like the only way to reclaim control, to make a statement that I was not willing to carry this insult for the rest of my life. I carried the gas cans up the creaking steps, the wood groaning under my weight. The front door stuck before giving way with a sharp crack, and I stepped inside. The air was colder inside than it had been outside. Dust clung to the furniture. The fireplace sat dark and lifeless. Covered in soot and cobwebs, the smell of damp wood filled my nose. I set the cans down and looked around, imagining the flames climbing the walls, the roof collapsing, and the insult finally disappearing. But then something caught my eye. On the stone fireplace, taped just above the mantel, was an envelope. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My father's. Bold and slightly uneven, but still his. Across the front were 2 words, to Darine. I froze. My hands, which had been reaching for the gasoline, dropped to my sides. I stared at the envelope, my chest tight. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. Was it some final apology? Another insult? Instructions on how to fix a leaky roof? My father was a man of few words, and the idea that he had left something behind for me alone made my stomach churn with confusion. I took a step closer and pulled the envelope free. The tape cracked as it came off the stone. For a moment, I simply held it, weighing it in my hands. My father had addressed this to me. Not to Mira. Not to both of us. To me. The same parents who had left me with what I thought was nothing had left behind something else. Hidden in this place I had planned to destroy. I slid my finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. The writing was shaky, but the words were clear. "My son," it began. I sank into the dusty chair by the cold fireplace and read. He wrote about how different Mira and I had always been, how she belonged to the world of business and society, and how I belonged to the woods, the land, the quiet places most people overlooked. He wrote that the estate was Mira's because she would know how to handle the wealth and the public life that came with it. But he wrote that I had something far greater waiting for me here. The letter gave me instructions. Behind the cabin, he wrote, there was a path that led into the woods. Half a mile in, there was an oak tree with a scar across its bark. Beneath that tree, he told me I would find the truth of my inheritance. "What you will discover there is yours alone," the letter said. "This is what I meant for you to have. Trust me, Darren, you will understand." By the time I finished reading, my hands were trembling. The gasoline can sat by the door, untouched. The matchbox still bulged in my coat pocket, but the fire I had been ready to set no longer made sense. Instead, another fire had started inside me. One fueled by curiosity and confusion. My father had never spoken like this when he was alive. I had spent my entire life thinking he never saw me, never understood me, never valued who I was. But these words suggested something different. I looked toward the back door, the snow-covered woods stretching beyond it. My father wanted me to find something there, something only for me. I set the letter on the mantel, pulled my coat tighter, and stepped back outside. The cold hit me again, sharper than before, but I ignored it. I walked around to the shed and found an old shovel leaning against the wall. It was rusted and worn, but sturdy enough. With the shovel in one hand and a flashlight in the other, I started toward the tree line. Every crunch of snow beneath my boots echoed in the silence. My breath puffed out in sharp bursts, and my mind raced with questions. What had he buried out here? Why had he hidden it from Mira? Why had he waited until death to tell me? I followed the path, the flashlight beam bouncing across the snow. The woods seemed darker than I remembered, and the cold bit through my gloves. But I kept going, my father's words playing over and over in my head. Half a mile in, just as he said, I saw the oak tree. Its bark was thick and scarred across the middle, as if it had been struck years ago and carried the wound ever since. I planted the shovel in the ground and began to dig. The earth was frozen solid, and every strike sent shocks through my arms. My breath grew heavier, my gloves grew damp with sweat. But I did not stop. Whatever was buried here was meant for me, and I was determined to find it. The first strike of the shovel against the frozen ground rang out like a gunshot in the silence of the woods. The blade bounced off the hard surface, sending a jolt up my arms. I gritted my teeth and struck again. The soil was locked in ice, and every movement felt like it would break me before it gave way. But I refused to stop. My father's letter had lit a fire inside me that no storm could smother. I drove the shovel down again and again, the metal scraping and cracking the earth. My breath came heavy and raw, each exhale rising in white plumes against the darkness. The flashlight, balanced on a branch, threw a weak circle of light across the tree roots. Shadows stretched and twisted with each swing of the shovel, making it feel like the woods were watching me. The longer I dug, the more I questioned what I was doing. Anger still lingered in me. A part of me thought this could all be a cruel trick. Another way my father reminded me I was different, never enough. Yet there was also a part of me, growing stronger with each strike of the shovel, that believed this could be real. He had chosen me for this, not Mira, me. After what felt like hours, I finally cracked through the top layer of frozen dirt. The shovel bit deeper into softer earth, and that small victory pushed me forward. I dug faster, my gloves damp with sweat, my shoulders aching. Every muscle in my body screamed, but I kept going. The sound of the shovel hitting roots and rocks echoed through the woods. My arms burned, but the thought of what might be waiting kept me moving. As the hole deepened, I paused and wiped my forehead with the back of my sleeve. I leaned on the shovel, breathing hard. The letter's words came back to me. What you will discover there is yours alone. This is what I meant for you to have. For the first time in years, I felt like my father had been speaking, directly to me, not to Mira, not to the family image, but to me. I thrust the shovel down once more, and it hit something solid. The sound was different, not the dull thud of rock or the snap of a root, but a hollow, metallic clang. My heart jumped in my chest. I dropped to my knees and brushed the dirt away with my hands. My fingers scraped against something cold and hard. There, buried under layers of soil and tangled roots, was the edge of a metal box. My pulse quickened as I clawed the earth away, pulling at the stubborn ground until the shape of the chest revealed itself. It was old and heavy, reinforced with iron bands. The surface rusted but still intact. The sight of it sent a shiver through me. I hooked my hands under the edges and heaved. The chest refused to move. I grabbed the shovel again and worked the earth around it, freeing it inch by inch until finally I was able to drag it up onto the surface. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sat back in the snow, staring at the box that had been waiting for me all this time. For a moment, I could not move. My hands trembled as I reached for the latch. I thought of Mira sitting in her Los Angeles estate, smug and certain she had won everything. I thought of the years I had spent wondering if my father had ever truly seen me, and now here I was, staring at a chest buried in the Montana woods left there for me to find. I pulled the latch, and the lid creaked open. Inside lay bundles of papers wrapped in oilcloth, carefully preserved against time and weather. I pulled one free and unwrapped it, my hands shaking. It was a journal, filled with my father's handwriting. I flipped through the pages, scanning words and phrases. He had written about the land, about his decision to purchase thousands of acres surrounding the cabin, and about his hopes for its future. He wrote about me too. "You were always most alive here," one page read. "This land matches your spirit. It needs someone who will love it. As it is, not carve it into pieces for profit. That someone has always been you." Tears stung my eyes as I read. My father had not been blind to who I was. He had known me better than I thought. The cabin had not been an insult. It had been the doorway to this. I dug deeper into the chest. There were maps, legal documents, and finally a deed. My name was written there in bold print. The land was mine. All of it. The cabin was not just a shack abandoned in the woods. It was the center of a legacy, one my father had hidden and preserved for me alone. The realization crashed over me. Mira had inherited the estate and the fortune, but I had been given something different, something larger, something alive. My parents had not forgotten me. They had trusted me. I sat there in the snow, the journal open in my lap, the chest heavy with the weight of my father's words. For the first time since the will had been read, I did not feel like the forgotten son. I felt chosen. The anger that had driven me to this place began to fade, replaced with something steadier, something deeper, a sense of belonging, of responsibility. The land stretched out around me, silent under the snow, waiting for me to decide what came next. I closed the chest, gripped the shovel, and stood. The night air was sharp against my skin, but it no longer felt hostile. My father had led me here with his letter, and I had followed. Now I understood why. I looked back toward the glow of the cabin through the trees. The plan to burn it down was gone. In its place was a new plan, one I had not expected. I would rebuild. I would restore. I would honor what my father had left me, not out of anger but out of love. That night in the woods, kneeling in the snow beside the oak tree, I crossed a line I could never step back from. My life had changed. My inheritance was no longer a burden. It was a calling. The chest was heavier than I expected. Dragging it back toward the cabin felt like hauling the weight of my entire childhood through the snow. My arms ached and my legs trembled, but I refused to stop. By the time I reached the porch, I was soaked with sweat beneath my coat and my gloves were stiff with ice. I kicked the door open with my boot and pulled the chest inside, setting it down in front of the fireplace. For a long moment, I just stood there staring at it. The flickering beam of my flashlight danced across the iron bands that held it together. This chest had been buried for years, maybe decades, waiting for me. The gasoline cans still sat by the door, silent reminders of the plan I had abandoned. I almost laughed at the thought of how close I had come to burning this cabin down, destroying the very place that held the truth. I knelt on the floor and opened the chest again. The papers inside were carefully wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture and decay. I lifted the first bundle and unwrapped it with shaking hands. My father's journals spilled out onto the floor, their leather covers cracked with age. I opened one at random, and his handwriting filled the page. The first entries were from years ago. He wrote about buying the land piece by piece, quietly, and without telling anyone. He described how he had fallen in love with the wilderness, how it reminded him of his own childhood in a small town far from the city. He wrote about wanting to preserve something untouched, something real, in a world that was always chasing money. I turned the page and found something that made me stop breathing. There was a photograph taped inside. It was of me as a boy, sitting on the porch of this very cabin, holding a fishing pole almost too big for my hands. My father had written beneath it, "Darren at his happiest. This is where he belongs." I had to set the journal down because my eyes burned too much to keep reading. All those years I had believed he never saw me, that he only valued Mira and her polished success, and yet here was proof that he had. He'd been watching me all along, not just watching but understanding me in ways I never gave him credit for. I picked up another bundle. This time it was maps, carefully drawn and marked with boundaries. They outlined thousands of acres of wilderness surrounding the cabin. Streams, hills, forests, all meticulously documented. At the bottom of one map was a note in my father's hand. Land to remain whole. For Darren. Next came the deed. My name was printed clearly, legally binding, with signatures and seals. My father had transferred everything to me long before he died. The land was mine. It was worth more than the Los Angeles estate, maybe even double. But that wasn't what shook me. It was what the land represented. It wasn't a pile of wealth to be flaunted or sold. It was a legacy, a responsibility, and he had trusted me with it. Beneath the documents, I found more journals. These were different. They weren't about land or money. They were about me. Page after page. My father had written about our time at the cabin. He described the first time I caught a fish on my own, the way my face lit up when I built a fire without help, how I would disappear into the woods for hours and come back with stories about the trails I had found. He wrote about how I never seemed happier than when I was here. You were not born for city lights, one entry read. You were born for open skies and quiet mornings. This place is your inheritance because it is who you are. I pressed my hand against the page, my chest tightening. For years, I had carried anger like a stone, believing I was unloved, unwanted, and overlooked. In that moment, reading his words, I realized how wrong I had been. My father had not overlooked me. He had understood me better than anyone else ever could. The room blurred as tears welled up in my eyes. I thought of Mira in her mansion, living a life of luxury. I thought of myself here, surrounded by snow and silence, holding my father's words in my hands. And for the first time, I did not feel cheated. I felt chosen. The chest held one more envelope, tucked beneath the journals. I opened it carefully. Inside was a short note in my father's hand. Darren, if you are reading this, then you found what I left for you. I know you were angry at me in life, and I do not blame you. I did not always say the right things, and I know I let you feel forgotten, but you were never forgotten. This land is yours because you are the only one I trust to protect it. Use it well. Make it your own. And know that I have always been proud of you. I read it twice, then 3 times, until the words blurred together. My body shook with the weight of it all. The anger I had carried since the will was read drained away, replaced by something steadier. Gratitude. Peace. I leaned back against the fireplace and closed my eyes. I thought of how close I had come to lighting a match and watching this place burn. Instead, I had uncovered the truth. My father had not left me nothing. He had left me everything that truly mattered. As the firelight flickered across the walls, I knew my life would never be the same. The cabin was no longer a symbol of rejection. It was the beginning of something far greater. The cabin no longer felt like a place of decay. Even with its sagging roof and drafty walls, it felt alive. The chest of journals and documents sat by the fireplace, and I kept finding myself drawn back to them. Each night, I lit a fire, settled into the chair, and read my father's words. The journals were more than instructions about the land. They were glimpses into his heart. He wrote about his hopes, his mistakes, and the love he had never spoken aloud. I began to see my parents differently. My mother's voice echoed in his pages, too. Small notes he had jotted about her humming while I explored the woods, or how she worried I would wander too far, but always smiled when I came back with stories. For years I had convinced myself they valued Mira more than me. But here was proof that, while they loved us differently, they did not love unequally. The anger that once consumed me was gone. In its place was purpose. I stopped seeing the cabin as a burden and started seeing it as the heart of something much bigger. Each morning, I woke to the sight of snow drifting through the trees, and I no longer felt like I had been cheated out of an inheritance. I felt entrusted with something sacred. I began the slow process of repairing the cabin. At first, it was basic patching leaks, fixing broken steps, sealing cracks in the walls. But as the weeks went on, I realized the work was more than physical. Every nail I hammered, every board I replaced, felt like stitching together pieces of myself. The boy who had once fished in the stream and built fires by hand was still here, and my father had known that. He had given me back not only land, but also myself. I thought often of Mira. Part of me wondered if she would ever understand why our parents made the choices they did. She had the mansion, the fortune, the life of wealth and status. But what I had been given could not be measured in dollars. It was measured in acres of untouched wilderness, in the sound of wind through the trees, in the legacy of trust left behind by my father. I did not feel the need to prove anything to her anymore. For the first time, I was content knowing I had exactly what was meant for me. The greatest lesson I took from all of this was simple. Inheritance is not always about money. Sometimes it is about being given what fits your soul, even if at first it feels like less. My parents had seen me clearly, even when I believed they had not. They had chosen differently for me, and in doing so, they had given me more than wealth. They had given me meaning. When I sat by the fire one evening, flipping through a journal that described the very oak tree where I had dug up the chest, I realized my life would never be the same. The cabin would no longer be a symbol of rejection. It would be a home, a place to build, a place to protect. The land around it would remain whole, just as my father had wanted, and I would be the one to guard it. I am not the forgotten son. I am the son they trusted, and that trust will guide me for the rest of my life. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. This was not just about money or inheritance. It was about discovering who I truly was and finally realizing how deeply I had been loved, even when I could not see it. If this story moved you, do me a favor. Like the video so it reaches more people. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Comment below and let me know what you would have done if you were in my place. And, most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Your support means everything, and it helps keep these stories alive.